All right, they can probably, everybody can hear me. Do me a favor and just let me know if I'm kind of in frame here. Is this a good spot?
Yep. So I'm gonna get out of the way. I'm gonna get my tape.
All good. All right, so welcome. Glad you're all here. This is a what I want to say, an episode of DevSecCon Virginia meetup. We're relatively new. We've actually been around for about a year, but this is our 5th event, I think. And we were meeting up closer to Norfolk in the past, and now we're here, thankfully, to hold on, because I am so awful with this. Yes, I remember now. Port and Starboard. Thank you, Port and Starboard. Jeff and Sarah and everybody from Port and Starboard making this space available to us. And they are Salesforce experts. So if you need anything that has to do with Salesforce, call Port and Starboard. Is there a website I can shout out?
I mean, Google Port and Starboard. Okay,
Google Port and Starboard, Virginia Beach. You'll find them.
So, otherwise, we find a spot.
It's a great space, though. I checked earlier. We got some people online, which is great. We got some people in person, and without any further adu, I'm going to hand it over to our NASA Smarties who are here to present tonight. And I'll introduce. Well, you all will introduce yourself, but I'm going to turn it over to John and John, and we're just going to take a moment as I hand off my my mic over here. So this mic is already live. John, make sure your mic is live.
I think we're good.
Here you go.
So, hey everyone. It was awesome chatting with you earlier. So I'm Jon Welters. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer of NASA Langley Research Center, which is about 45 minutes north of here. So show of hands, how many knew that there was a NASA center so close? 4. So,
oh, good. That's good.
Yeah,
that's a higher percentage than normal.
It is. Yeah. So this we're going to talk about a lot of the challenges and a lot of some of the oddities that we run into given the nature of the work that NASA does. So. I started out as a contractor at NASA in 2013. I started out as a systems administrator in the air traffic operations lab. Spent a little bit of time in private industry in between there for a privacy-focused cell phone startup, and then I came back, became system architect at that very same lab. Worked in configuration aerodynamics branch, aeroacoustics, and then became a civil servant and started off as our red team lead. So penetration testing, did a lot of vulnerability management, moved on to core operations, which also had me take on a lot of incident response manager duties. And then I've done a few enterprise projects, some of our enterprise logging, and then data analytics for cyber, and now I'm the CISO center CISO for Langley. So that's my story.
So my story is surprisingly almost exactly the same, through only a coincidence of making good choices, right? So I started out as the IT security manager over one of NASA's major IT contracts. It was ACES at the time, which was an HP enterprise contract. And then worked my way through that, eventually kind of transitioned to serve on the incident response team, became the lead forensics analyst for some time as a contractor, and then applied to civil service as the incident response manager that oversees digital forensics and investigations for NASA Langley. And then I sort of acted in the role of deputy CISO for a couple of years before they actually posted the position. And then I formally took that over. The person that was in it before was working all the enterprise projects that John eventually tried to take on and execute. And so, and then from there, I served as the deputy CISO in a supervisory capacity, which was a little bit different. So got to learn the trials and tribulations of government work and forming a new organization with an entirely new supervisory chain and structure behind it, which is a shockingly complicated process. So that was fun. And then eventually applied for my current position where I'm the agency level lead information system security manager, which in NASA talk really means I'm more or less the CISO over a particular set of projects that have some different security constraints than our regular enterprise projects. So think experiments and ICS systems and things like that, the stuff that doesn't fall under the regular FISMA accreditation boundaries. So
yeah, so my domain is everything else, the stuff that absolutely does fall under FISMA. So, and that's the interesting thing about when we talk cyber at NASA, it's really not all that different from any other executive agency under the executive branch of government. We follow NIST standards, National Institute of Standards and Technology, various special publications in the 800 series. It's just what we're applying them to is a little bit unique. You have everything from Voyager, launched in 1977, that's past the termination shock in the solar system and in interstellar space, all the way to we have general counsel, we have accountants, we have HR. Your normal workstation type devices. And then we have those industrial control systems that Jon mentioned. Langley is, we're very famous for a lot of the wind tunnel facilities that we have. If you've ever seen a picture, an aerial view of Langley, those giant spears right on the main road there, those are actually vacuum chambers for our hypersonics tunnel. So hypersonics is speeds above Mach 5. So a lot of research done in that area. So it was kind of interesting. I remember, I'll never forget it because I've always been a huge NASA fanboy. My first time going on center and having a tour, and just you can just point at any random building and there's something amazing going on in there. Hey, what's over there? Oh, that's where they're testing inflatable habitats for the lunar surface. And everything from simulating a Martian atmosphere to testing the high gain antenna for Europa Clipper, or testing rotors for Dragonfly, which is eventually a drone that's going to fly on Titan, which is a moon of Saturn. So those are the kind of things that we're talking about. And then the support systems that drive that research. How do we appropriately put those in boundaries that make sense, and how do we apply the correct controls to them to make sure that those three cornerstones of cybersecurity, that confidentiality, integrity, and availability are met?
So one of the interesting things that's sort of, I want to say different, but probably farther out there than typically you think of. NASA is organized as a research agency for the most part, in space exploration and all that too, but what we really focus on is research. We're not a university. Sometimes people forget that, and that causes us some hang up, right? So when we bring researchers out from academia and they start doing government work, a lot of the work we do is very open. We run one of the largest open science data centers in the world out of NASA Langley. It's public. You can go to science.larc.nasa.gov and access all the atmospheric science data that you can shovel into your computer. And so when we start working with those folks who are working on these very public projects where we want people to take our data, everybody, we don't care who, you can be in another country, you can have our climate data. That's cool. But we still have to protect the system. We still have to follow all of the rules bestowed upon us by, Congress, executive orders, CISA. CISA is a cybersecurity infrastructure agency under DHS, and then also all of our NASA policies and procedures and all of that. Just because what you're working on is open science data doesn't mean you get to skip all that, right? And so the same thing sort of applies, specific to sort of the DevSec efforts. Just because the code that you're working on is working with fairly non-sensitive things people sometimes forget that it's really important that it's still accurate. And so when you look at cybersecurity, everybody thinks confidentiality, integrity, and availability. 90% of the layman people that we talk with only kind of recognize confidentiality.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we think of the majority of the data that we sort of offer up that's public and we want to be transparent with, remembering the integrity and the availability is really key, because people are using it and they're relying on it. And there are people who maybe might want to change it and tell a different story, or maybe might want to change it just to face websites and make NASA look bad. And so maintaining the sort of security of those underlying applications that happen to be doing fairly mundane things from a security perspective is really important. And oftentimes, I wouldn't say it gets forgotten, but it gets deprioritized. And so our roles have always kind of been to help support as we onboard new developers, as we onboard new sysadmins, and the support staff that makes it all work. We have to ingrain this thought process of whether you're working on the most sensitive thing that our agency does, or weather data to publish whether the tide's going to go up 1 foot or 3. We have to maintain the integrity of the information with respect to all the policies, but also we have to do good by the American people and put out good data that's actionable and use the resources well. And so that's one of the struggles. And we're going to go through some of the things that we thought kind of crossed over from DevSec to NASA, and largely most of them probably apply to most government agencies. And I think everything we listed actually applies to all executive agencies, except for maybe a couple space-specific things. But I think that's probably the biggest NASA-ism in the whole talk, is we're different in the sense that the majority of our work is kind of public. It's for the good of humankind. I don't know our motto. Probably should have memorized it, but that's part of the motto, right?
Yeah, and so to absolutely to put a point on that focusing on that integrity and availability piece. So I mentioned the Air Traffic Operations Lab. So that lab was actually almost purpose-built originally to run software called ATOS, Air Traffic Operations Simulation. And this software was designed to simulate the next generation airspace. And when I say next generation, not traditionally what we know of with our traditional flight displays for pilots and traditional air traffic controller displays, but new techniques on things like separation assurance, things like interval management. How close can we safely get aircraft together in the air? But also introducing elements of what the future is likely going to look like. Things like unmanned aerial vehicles, supersonic aircraft over land. So there's a project being run out of Langley right now, which is the X-59. Quest, Quiet Supersonic Transport, and that aircraft is being built out at Armstrong in California. And it's having that software, doing that research. ATOL will run what they call HITL experiments, human in the loop, where we'll take pilots from industry and we'll take air traffic controllers that are actively, we'll take them away from their station and we'll sit them in chairs, just like they would be at their normal day-to-day, and we'll run through these scenarios. And obviously there's a tremendous cost to that. That software needs to be incredibly robust, because any downtime, that's a lot of cost. That's time lost in the time that you have you're such a limited time frame to collect this research data, which you might spend years analyzing. Some of those human factors elements that you're trying to observe, that's irreplaceable. So you want to absolutely make sure that you know your stakeholders' requirements, that you understand the cost of any downtime, and you're able to sort of quantify that. And that was the first time. I'm not a developer by any means, but that was the first time I had heard the terms regression testing. Making sure that any changes you introduced haven't regressed the capability of your software. It was the first time I ever heard about continuous integration, continuous development pipelines, and where we could inject security. Because again, we're not just talking about confidentiality, that integrity, that preventing unauthorized changes to the outputs of your software, and then that availability, maintaining the uptime, maintaining the usability. how can we shift that security piece as close to the beginning of the software development lifecycle as possible? That's really key for a research institution. Langley does a lot of research, hence Langley Research Center. Researchers have to account for any potential changes that could have affected their research data, or else when it goes to peer review, that's going to come up. So you have things like configuration freezes, and then you have to apply the correct control set and the appropriate mitigations to handle that scenario, that very specific scenario.
Kind of not really the inverse, but a different way of looking at it. If you're building an airplane that costs $100 million and you start out with no cybersecurity and you're 75% through, and you go to your first review that you bother to invite a cybersecurity person to, what happens? What do? Luckily, we don't have to answer that because we avoid it. But that's something that you have to be really careful of. And I think it becomes much more apparent as the government as a whole, and certainly NASA, looks to commercial industry to solve some of our problems, because commercial industry is starting to be equipped to do so. So when we start to look to commercial industry to solve some of these very complicated problems, we issue contracts. Contracts have cybersecurity clauses that are pretty consistent through the federal government. For the most part, contractors read them, not always, but they always sign them. And then when they deliver their end product, oftentimes there's a lot of conversations around making sure that they're meeting those requirements. Sometimes they're not pleasant conversations. So I think one of the things we struggle with, it's going to sound like a broken record, because I think we're kind of talking to an audience that can help us fix this, is when people bid on these contracts or do this work, the folks reviewing the contracts are accountants or they're business people, and they're reading it and it says, "Thou shalt comply with this law, 18 USC 799. My favorite law. I don't know if everybody has a favorite law. 18 USC 799 is my favorite law. 18 USC 799 says if you violate a NASA policy, that's a 1-year misdemeanor. Doesn't really work with Schoolhouse Rock, right? Because that guy can author a NASA policy. You violate it, you can get a 1-year misdemeanor. But still my favorite law. And so NASA policy says that we have to comply with FISMA. We have to comply with directives from CISO. Go ahead.
Well, what does a 1-year misdemeanor mean in this context? Like, what's the impact of that? Like, can't work for NASA for a year?
Jail.
Oh.
Yeah. So it's not commonly used, right? I mean, that was created in the 80s, I think, because we were operating in very large complexes. And I don't know all the gist behind it, but it's an actual law that can be used and has been. But anyway, it's my favorite one because it's a little bit special. As far as I know, we're the only single agency that has it. The DoD has a similar law. If you violate a DoD policy and curl up on their fence line or whatnot, you'll see it written on all the signs and the fences. You can look it up. If you go to NASA, you'll see 18 USC 799. But if you look up the law, super easy. It's 2 lines. I don't have it memorized, but I mean, it's a fun thing, right? But I guess my point is, we put these things in the contracts, but the people who could actually understand what we're saying aren't the people who are agreeing to it. And then when it comes time to deliver, or when it comes time to do the work, all of a sudden we're faced with the technical folks who were never told that this was part of the package deal. And then we end up with software, services, and products that might not meet the requirement. And we're in this really harsh spot of being the cybersecurity folks, trying to figure out what's acceptable and what's not. What do we have to go back and fix? What can we accept and move on with? We're not authorized to accept risk, but what can we pose that we accept and move on with?
Yeah.
Or what is a showstopper? What is just not acceptable? And how does that change from vendor to vendor? So one of the people like to compare, right? So if you're vendor A, you happen to quit working for vendor A and go working for vendor B, and you know NASA accepted that for vendor A, by golly, when you submit your proposal, you're going to tell us about that. And then we have to figure out how to disposition it. And so it's really important to read those things, but it's also really important to understand what they mean and the implications of what it entails, right? And I don't know how to solve that, right? Because I think all of us sort of recognize that as a thing. When you have business folks, they're trying to land business, which is great. That's their job. They don't necessarily need to understand all of the technical requirements. But I feel like there's not always the right technical people on these review teams to understand, yeah, you really do have to submit a security plan to the government if you're going to operate an information system on behalf of the government. And that's a requirement, not a desirement. And so, I don't know. That's kind of my continual plea for help in every venue that they let me talk to anybody ever. Because if we could solve that problem, we could get so much more done.
Yeah, and that's really where us as cybersecurity professionals can also help out a little bit in just being able to articulate those requirements with that shared vocabulary, depending on the audience that you're talking about. I mean, obviously, we're fairly technical people, so we tend to talk in those acronyms. Like we keep throwing out FISMA. I don't know that you necessarily know what FISMA is. So that there's one great example. When we go and talk to some of the contracting officers and things like that, or some of the system stakeholders, they're not going to have that shared vocabulary. They're not going to use that same nomenclature. So you try to find that common ground. Langley being Langley, obviously very storied in flight. I love the flight analogies because a lot of pushback we get sometimes is with certain documentation requirements. And while it might be a really long story behind why it's required for a reason. Very rarely do we actually have requirements that are just completely pointless, but it's all part of risk management. So an example of that, pilots, right? You can take those flight analogies. A checklist for something that you do 1,000 times in your career, but you do it to make sure that you're doing it the exact same way every time for the safety of the aircraft. You don't necessarily need to know the 70 years worth of commercial aviation that ended up in you doing this checklist. You do it, and try filing a flight plan when you're flying instrument, or try not filing a flight plan when you're flying instrument flight rules too. That sort of documentation, that sort of accountability. Again, you don't need to necessarily know all the events that led up to it, though it certainly helps, but you also trust that there's a reason for you doing that. And that applies to security as well. We're just a much less just mature sort of field. And I say mature just of sheer length of time where it's really been relevant. You have 70 plus years of aviation and the FAA and the NTSB and all of these networks to share all of that accident investigation when something happens and those reports are made public and recommendations are made. Cybersecurity is we're really starting to do that. We're really starting to share that information. And that's what some of these executive orders that we're going to talk about are starting to get at. And you'll see the very first line there, removing those barriers to threat information sharing between government and private sector. That's absolutely key. A mitigation that works for a certain type of malware, you want to put that out there, and you want to put it out there to the people that it can help the most. But in putting it out there, you might have just opened yourself up as a target for other attacks. And that's the trade-off, right? And that's something that makes that data sharing piece somewhat difficult sometimes. So we have agencies like Jon had mentioned, CISO, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency under Homeland, does a fantastic job with trying to organize that and collate that information and distribute it, not just to government agencies, but to the private sector as well.
We've done a pretty good job. I say we, meaning the whole government, but certainly NASA. When we know we have contract partners or even education partners, which are typically contracts or grantees, or we're working under a Space Act agreement, which is kind of a special authority NASA has to farm in or farm out work. But we kind of have that list of people, and we have managed to help them make connections with agencies that can help them proactively identify vulnerabilities, or served as an intermediary where we were able to brief them on a problem they had. appropriately and resolved before it became a real issue, right? And so that's been in the last couple of years where now we really are connected and we have to act as one team because that's what we are. In the technical realms, that's easy, right? Our equivalent people, whether it's a CISO or incident handler or whoever it is in most companies, we kind of talk the same language and walk the same walk. So the conversation itself is easy. Making the connection and sort of getting the corporate buy-in to go from whoever the contact the government knows about to the person that we can actually do some good stuff with is sometimes a challenge because there is a sense of corporate information, right? There's proprietary information. There's, I don't know, there's some barriers where the people who we often get given the contact for really aren't the people that would be best to talk to. So we really appreciate the ability to kind of reach in and say, can you please just patch this server? Patch them all, but this one, this please, right? And so when we form those relationships, it's super helpful. So we can just call and say, hey, we think this is a problem. Take a look. Can you just patch it soon? And sure, it's patched. Thank you. All right, we'll tell you what it was in a couple of weeks. That's fine. But it's really important for us to form those relationships, at least with our major contractors and our major partners, where we know they have sensitive NASA data, or where we know that they're a big part of our business model. And I think, to John's point, we talked a little bit how we want to get better, continuously get better at the partnerships that we have with corporations and trying to sort of communicate more from the cybersecurity level as opposed to the government core to core. We really want a contracting officer representative or contracting officer at the business level. We need to figure out how to make the connections at the cyber level and talk the cyber talk and just help each other. Because in the end, we're all interested in that. Sort of the reverse, and our segue to talking about executive orders and CISA is that it's kind of the opposite, right? So how many folks have had to work with US CERT back when it existed? So US CERT was joyful. They did a lot of good things and they did them reasonably well. They also did a lot of good things and didn't communicate very well about them. When CISA came about, they changed a lot in that CISA is all about talking to the right people at the right time. US CERT did a great job of establishing a national program and executing it and completing the mission that it had. The government recognized that there was a need to kind of change that model a little bit and go from being a CERT to an agency that really looked at the infrastructure and the key things that supported the nation. Two different points of view. One somewhat reactionary, although it was called the readiness team, but it was really a reactionary body. They issued memos to fix things. CISA is taking a very different approach where they're saying, here's what's out there, here's how you can mitigate it, and they're doing the best they can to do that at the lowest level possible and making it available to anybody, but at the appropriate levels of security so people can readily get to it. It's a huge plus for us. It's moving forward in a way where we can refer to a CISA directive or an executive order and everybody can get to it. That wasn't always the case in the past. And more importantly, everybody pretty much has to follow them. The executive orders are a little odd, and the CISA directives are a little odd because there are some government agencies that aren't compelled to follow them. But for the most part, those agencies are compelled to follow their own sets of rules, which are generally more stringent than CISA's. So we can still do the information exchange and have the same sorts of conversations. So,
yeah, and a good example of one of those, throw it out there. So BOD 2201, one of my favorites. So BOD is binding operational directive. That's one of the directive types that
I just realized how lame we are. I have a favorite BOD and you have a favorite BOD.
Sure do.
We've been doing this for too long.
So that's the one that introduced the KEV, the Known Exploitable Vulnerabilities Catalog, which is tremendously useful because this has already documented and done the legwork for, yeah, we can get a laundry list of scan results, okay, well, again, prioritization, context, risk mitigation. Which ones of these do I actually care about that I can dedicate my limited resources, because we never have enough resources to actually mitigate the problem, take the risk level down to where it's acceptable. CISA put together that known exploitable vulnerabilities catalog for what they're observing around the country, around the world, with what's being actively exploited and what's being used to compromise systems. So that's a great example of some of what they put out. And then there's things like emergency directives, like, for example, the log4shell, log4j vulnerabilities last December. That resulted in an emergency directive. So things like that, really marshaling the agencies and mobilization effort. That's some of we have a very close partnership with them. We have frequent calls with them, and we share that intel, and that's critical, and that's only going to become more critical as the threat landscape evolves and changes ever faster.
But I think it's important, like the difference I've seen. So when I started with NASA, we were still flying the space shuttle. And being here from then until now, and working with US CERT and CISA and seeing how it's matured over the years, probably just in the last couple of years, we've gotten to where calls with CISA are a conversation. Right? They have what they want to share. We have what we want to share. It's a two-way, genuine conversation. It wasn't always like that. So I think that's a way better way to do business. Everybody is much more comfortable. You're more able to share what's happening within your groups. And that's what I hope to have with everybody I work with, whether they're a contractor, whether they're an intern, whatever they are, right? We have to figure that out. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some sort of fundamental changes in big government. The last 2 or 3 years, the government really started taking a more public look at supply chain management, right? Mm-hmm. So we saw executive orders banning certain software companies, certain hardware manufacturers, and we see those change faster than probably practical, because in some cases it's an awful lot of work to figure out, all right, what hardware is actually manufactured by this company, who has this embedded video decoder chip. Sometimes you got to break out hand lens and start looking at chip numbers to figure that out. It's not easy, because people are buying them and embedding them in OEM products, and it still counts, right? And so that's not new in government. We've always done that. It's just now it's being exposed to the general population and enforced in a more even keel, right? So one of the things that we have to do, and everybody has to have a process to establish where any software we use was developed. Mm-hmm. And the keyword is where it was developed, right? And I don't know, are you all kind of aware that that's a thing the government has to do now? Maybe not. So we have a requirement when we buy software to certify its a certificate of origin. So that's the country in which it was developed. There are some constraints where there's a little flexibility, but in general, it has to be developed. We have to know. And then we do a risk-based assessment on a variety of factors, but that's a new thing. So every time we buy software, we have to have the company supply us with some level of certification as to where it was developed. So if you go on vacation, that may impact that, right? People don't think about that. It probably won't, realistically. But like if you're solely developing an app, you're the only dev, and it's a small app, and you happen to go on vacation to a particular high-risk country and write a bunch of code there, your company should disclose that when they're selling the software to the government, and it might make it so we can't buy it because it fits into that risk analysis.
Talk about the CEO. Sorry for interrupting, but when you talk about the certificate of origin, we had when I was in the military, we had to buy the same thing. So it was like hardware side though. Yeah. And they still had to disclose the same type of thing for the hardware side. Like we couldn't buy stuff from China or anybody that would be sort of risky element. So it's kind of the same thing.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's just, I think now it's pretty equally applied throughout the government agencies. So for NASA, it's not new on the sort of higher security stuff, and it's not new on the lower security stuff. The difference is we talk about a lot more. So in the past, we made everybody submit stuff. We ran it through supply chain management. We told them whether they could buy it or not. The difference now is it's in the public eye. They know that that's what we're looking at. They know that that's what we're doing. And I think it's helped people see some light in cybersecurity, because not everything gets approved, right? Somebody might be buying something as mundane as I don't know,
Printer.
a printer is a good example, or like an IPTV camera. Those are always rough because a couple of the band companies are major manufacturers of those things.
Smart TVs, that's another one.
Smart TVs.
Yeah, some of the embedded OSs that they run.
But it's a challenge for us. And it's another one of those things that sometimes doesn't get caught right away, because people want to land the business, people want to get their product out there. And then when we finally get it in and start testing and reviewing it, and we find this piece of hardware is embedded and we didn't realize it. Or maybe they use the software toolkit that was never disclosed as included in the product that we're not happy with the risk of, or legislatively unable to use, right? And so, I don't know, it's really important that we keep in mind all of the implications as things get bundled and things get rolled up, and the COO stuff and all of the compliance that we're faced with. And I will say compliance and security aren't the same thing. And so part of our job is to walk that line and figure out the pieces of compliance that really are in our wheelhouse, and the pieces of compliance that are just compliant. And I think in order to hit home with our developers and our software engineers and our systems admins and our researchers and our scientists and our director level people, like, we have to be honest about the fact that there are compliance things that are compliance things. There's a reason we have to do it. Might be a little reason, might be a big reason. They're compliance things. There's cybersecurity things that we genuinely care about and can demonstrate make a significant difference in our security posture. We like to focus our time on the latter. Sometimes rules force us to focus our time on the former. But the more transparency we can achieve with our partners, the more time we can spend on the actual security problem.
And that's what makes cybersecurity very much not just an IT risk, but a business risk as well. Those compliance items, those regulations that there's different levels, right? Some you absolutely have to follow, or the consequences are not going to be great for your business. And similarly, on the other side of it, actually making something secure. If there's a breach, that's a huge reputation hit. That's a reputation hit to your business. Customers aren't going to want to work with you if they don't think that you're going to protect their data while they're working with you. So that's definitely cross-cutting.
And I think in general, looking at our other bullet points, making sure we've covered them, standardization is also kind of becoming key. But when they first sort of issued edicts around standardizing processes and procedures, that scared me, because in my experience, people tend to standardize the lowest possible level of competency, right? Because if everybody has to be able to achieve it, oftentimes the standards are set to the lowest level everybody can achieve. I've been pleasantly surprised that that's not what the government's generally chosen to do. They set the standardization level at a reasonable point most of the time, and people have had to rise up and meet it. Unfortunately, some people have had to kind of either adjust and focus on something else, or kind of lower down and meet it, and spend the time doing what is useful under the guidance that we have. But the things that NASA's doing should be the same things the other executive agencies are doing, and they should look pretty similar. So if we have a security incident, the way that we respond to it, the amount of resources we throw at it, given the same level of risk, another executive agency should respond to it in a very similar manner. Department of Treasury, whatever, doesn't matter what agency, but that should look very much alike. We shouldn't have an incredibly large response and another agency just ignore it and write it off as a minimum risk incident, wipe and reload. And meanwhile, we're spending time with 6 analysts trying to decrypt this packed executable that infected, a single workstation. I did that for years. It's great. But
and part of what's come out of this executive order in particular was those common incident response playbooks to do exactly what John just mentioned, have that consistent response to incidents. So we're reacting as one.
I think the pie in the sky is to have the consistency enough that if we need search support, we can look to other agencies to supply it.
Yep.
I'm kind of curious. I didn't realize the date of the executive order. That was just 7 months before Log4Shell, which you brought up before. And given your tenure, I'm curious if you noticed a difference between the response to that and prior vulnerabilities that have come up, since it was, we're kind of in the age of this executive order 7 months later.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and answer that. So I was core. That was when that came out. When that hit the streets, I was core operations team lead. So I was doing. I was leading the bulk of the vulnerability management efforts too. And I have to say, when that emergency directive came out, we immediately jumped on calls with CISO, with other federal agencies. They had a GitHub repo that they set up that they were helping to do a tremendous amount of legwork to identify where. I mean, Log4j is everywhere. It's the premier Java logging library. So it's and you see that famous over 1 billion devices or whatever, however billions devices every time you install it. So I mean, this was everywhere, and it was embedded in so much. So a lot of it was, and just the nature of the vulnerability too, it wasn't something you could really passively scan for unless you had something like a credential scan. You couldn't necessarily grab a version number, especially if it was embedded in something that a logic controller, something that you wouldn't necessarily have like SSH access to be able to grab a version string and check that. It was the vulnerability itself required some sort of active, because it was the JNDI library, the way it worked. If you sent an attack string, it would beacon out to whatever domain, and it would grab a base 64 encoded command that, all of that. So it was something that, unless you had the infrastructure in place to perform that sort of active scanning, you really wouldn't necessarily know what your full, the actual threat was to your organization and the equipment that you're running. So a lot of the advice initially was, contact the vendor of this stuff and ask that. And we all know how that can go sometimes, but CISO was doing that legwork right out of the gate. And they were making contact with the major vendors and asking them those questions. And hey, what products are affected? What are you doing about it? And they put this all in a nicely organized repository. They linked to the vendor mitigations as they came out with them, because obviously they weren't available initially. But as those sort of patches and mitigations came out, and if you remember, I think it was 2.15 that was the vulnerable version, and then Apache really we got 2.16, which I think was vulnerable to a DDoS attack.
Yeah.
Then we got 2.17, and that was in the span of like 2 weeks. But without that coordination, we would not have had nearly the successful response that we saw, or the response rate, because it takes a long time to do that research. If you think of how many different vendors' products were affected and how many different vendors' products you had all over your network.
I can't remember the name of the vulnerability, but when I was doing incident response and forensics, was during a time period when one of the first sort of major memory leak vulnerabilities popped up. I don't remember the name of it. Everybody would recognize it if I did, but the government wasn't nearly as coordinated. From our perspective, the easiest way for me to get a detection kit was to write one, and I did. And we sent it out to people and said, "Hey, this kind of works, we think." Right. But like, I'm not that guy. I'm an incident response person trying to see if my servers are compromised. And I happened to have a team where we could assemble a toolkit. And really, it wasn't so much a team, it was the infrastructure, because the detection mechanism was sort of ridiculously easy. So I still don't know if the reason why there wasn't a tool released earlier was because it was so easy that people just assumed you could figure it out, or that I was just the first one to write one. Because I want to say we had it written and sort of partially proof tested within like an hour of figuring out how the exploit worked. And it was reasonably easy to test because you basically just injected some random data into some particular sections of memory on a Linux system, and it would kick back consistent data from another section of memory, depending on what you injected, and you could time it to the point where you could dump the whole system memory and sort of direct it on what to give you. And so it was fairly easy to do a unit test and just say, do this 5 times, reference the same bit every time, and see if it's different. And you know, it really wasn't difficult to develop. What I came up with was ridiculously inefficient. From a software perspective, no good. But I think it was the first one that we could get out there. Ended up packaging it as a Metasploit module, I think, and making it available to whoever within the government, because we couldn't release it publicly, so we had to go through a software release process, which we know and love. But we made it available to those people who we could. And then by the end of the day, everybody and their brother had a detection mechanism. So all of your tennis, Nessus, McAfee at the time had the vulnerability manager still. What was the other one that was big? It wasn't Rapid7, Retina. I don't know if anybody remembers Retina. EI Retina. That was not my favorite. But they also, you know, kicked it out right away. And eventually they just included it in Nmap.
Yeah.
And so, but it was really neat to see, like, maybe 4 years later, the situation John talked about, where when it happened, the whole government came together and had a fairly unified response, versus Jon Welters, the guy who's sort of an expert in the forensics side of the house, is seemingly the first one to get a detection mechanism for this thing available. I don't know, 2 totally different responses, and it's kind of impressive how much change we made. Just we is probably subjective, but how much change, you know, the government made just in the 3 or 4 year period between those events.
Mhm.
It really was night and day.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now it's time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
It's literally slide 1 of 2.
Yeah.
Exactly the water level
Yeah.
last 2.
So one of our many challenges in government is, well, just like anywhere else, it does take some effort to get public presentations approved, and so it's short because we got it approved. But our big thing here was we thought this audience would be akin to having more of a conversation, and we wanted to understand what we thought would be useful to present to you all. So that's why when we went around and talked to people beforehand, we could kind of put some of that in.
Yeah.
I don't think any of this is horribly enlightening. The big thing is, for us, it's nice that now these executive orders, just kind of a strange thing that you need an executive order to tell people to patch. But, you know, it's nice that those apply to the whole government. Well, most of the government, but the majority of the government. We're not alone. So in the past, if we decided to escalate patching something, we were kind of on our own. So if we had a competing project with another agency, all of a sudden they have a competitive advantage because they're not having to shut down a week and patch, or they're not having to shut down a day and patch. And we're over here making everybody patch. And so I think that's one of the big benefits that we've seen. At the same time, it puts more pressure on vendors to actually produce patches, because now it's not just NASA waiting for you to patch, or it's not just Treasury or Justice or whoever. Is everybody saying, hey, we can't be having this vulnerable log4j. And so it's a bit more of a force to be reckoned with as far as trying to be compliant with all of it.
Yeah, and some of what's come out of the past few years too. Some of those where those tools have been standardized across the federal government. That means if, as John was mentioning, that if you read a novel detection for something that just came out, easily sharing that, and other federal agencies can take that and utilize it right away, because they're running those common tool sets, and it also gives you a much greater influence with those vendors to create that content for those. If it's a configuration management tool or something like that, that's always very helpful to have when it's not just a single agency but many.
It also gamifies a little bit.
Same need.
Back, I don't know, 5 years ago, trying to gamify training was the hip thing. Whenever you did training, it had to be a game, or it wasn't considered good training. You had to be able to win and beat people. So that's kind of what we did the whole government, right? These executive orders, we have to do periodic unified progress reporting. That means it's a game. You don't want to be the one that loses that game. And so at the agency executive level, it does kind of put a scorecard up, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so those scorecards drive compliance, and hopefully compliance drives security, right? But the presence of the scorecards that all agencies now have to have is very much relevant. One of the things that sort of shocks me that you can look up, it's on the internet. Take a look at how many websites different government agencies have. There's a variety of tools you can do that. You'll find that it's probably shocking. The DoD, be it by far the largest sort of footprint, does not have the most websites. It changes over time because there's a few agencies that are close, so I don't want to misquote it. But the DoD is nowhere near the top, and so when you look at that, it's sort of shocking. It's enlightening that you wouldn't think about the problems some of these agencies have, but it's a different problem set. NASA has a lot of websites because we do a lot of things, and people like to have websites much less than we used to. But some agencies have to have many because they all serve different functions and for different localities or whatnot. But it's amazing the sheer breadth. There's thousands and thousands of websites that government agencies are hosting and dealing with. There didn't used to be very much consistency in them. Now government websites should be fairly consistent. You should always see an actual human contact that you can reach out to if there's a problem. You should always see a privacy notice, et cetera, right? I think it's getting better. And I think CISA is a big part of that. I feel like this is an advertisement for CISA, and you didn't realize that.
No, they really do a tremendous job. But other things that certainly from a developer standpoint that this executive order sort of prompted was really a series of OMB memos. OMB being the Office of Management and Budget. So a couple in particular, and Mike, if you wouldn't mind advancing to the next slide here, we can talk about a few of them. So. John already touched upon supply chain risk management, software supply chain security. Event logging is a huge one, and again, as the person who led the agency's enterprise cyber logging for Spell, that's, if you ever have a chance, M2131 is the OMB memo. Go ahead and write that down. The breadth is incredible what it requires. So that it splits event logging into what they're calling maturity models, and we're talking really redefining what it means to have that security data available for incident response. And those requirements were born out of, boy, what do we really wish we had during, SolarWinds or something of that scale. So if you go and look at those requirements also apply to NASA. We write a lot of our own software for sure, especially Langley being a research center. All those requirements, those logging requirements, things that your program needs to log, like audit events, if it has role-based access controls built in, who's doing what, when, timestamps, being able to the timestamps thing is huge. Being able to sync up using protocols like NTP, cron, that you could tell that a lot of thought was put into the requirements in that memo. It's very comprehensive, and they also apply to all of that custom written software too. Those auditable events. So it would behoove really any developer to sort of be familiar with that and make sure that the capability is there to log it, especially if you're looking to do business with the federal government.
So I think that kind of leads into I think the last piece we haven't talked about is really the zero trust architecture and ultimately the contracts. But the problem with the contracts is in order to fit all of these requirements into a contract, we'd add like 100 pages to every contract. So it's a challenge, right? But the zero trust architecture is an interesting series of buzzwords, because if you ask 10 people what it means, you're going to get 10 slightly different responses. You're probably going to get 10 slightly different responses and 9 slightly different responses and one way out there one, right? So it's interesting. The government has a definition for it through these executive orders and memorandums that says one thing. Vendors take that to mean another thing sometimes, but it's an interesting pickle, right? Because people have their own ideas. And I think the way the government's written it up as far as the actual requirements isn't necessarily the same as what people think they are. So it's one of those situations where if you're somebody who's writing software to help with zero trust, or that's part of a product or service that is meant to kind of help that along, read what the government actually says, not what maybe people told you it was.
And that memo is M2209. Listen, as says, I need to know these things. Yes, I have to be able to explain them and obviously execute them at my center level. So that's to Jon's point, everyone will have a slightly different definition, but instead of that trust but verify, it's that never trust, always verify sort of mindset. And it's at a high level from a networking perspective. I started off as a network engineer, so this stuff is absolutely near and dear to my heart. Sort of that ability to do that micro segmentation, not just from a basic, hey, I'm going to put IP-based firewall rules into this subnet and separate these boundaries with a firewall, and then everything on this side I know is completely trusted no matter what's in it, just by the mere fact that it's in this specific subnet or this specific location of my network. No, it's the ability to implement technologies like software-defined architecture and software-defined networking and be able to dynamically change policy or apply policy on a per interface basis or from a workload standpoint, from a role standpoint. What is this device actually doing? What is it supposed to be doing? What is the least amount of privilege it could possibly have and still accomplish what it's actually meant to do? Things like that. NASA, we ended up being in a very good position. We already started rolling a lot of that out before this executive order was even released. So we're continuing down those paths, and from a policy standpoint too, it's really driving that, giving us that along with the logging, giving us that visibility to respond appropriately, and not just respond appropriately, but also contain a lot faster than we ever have been able to before. With a lot of this, and bringing those behavioral analytics too into the fold. For example, if I see a machine that just logged in at Langley, and all of a sudden 5 minutes later that same device logged in overseas, it's a little bit of a red flag that something might be going on. But I could possibly automate the response to that and say, you're done, and we're going to figure out what's going on before we move forward with anything. So that's really what all of this is amounting to is those capabilities, and that's all been on our roadmap, all been in work, and we're continuing to pursue those heavily.
So we kind of try to touch on the pieces that we thought sort of interacted with the DevSec community that we could in the public setting, and share instances where we could kind of relate it to NASA work. I think all of these things are challenges that aren't impossible to overcome, but they take a lot of work. And as NASA and the federal government in general starts to really reach out and leverage private government partnerships and education government partnerships, it's important that we get to the point where we're all sharing in these, I wouldn't say requirements, because I think sharing requirements doesn't necessarily result in people doing them, but in sharing the need to secure our infrastructure and take these steps. I think the government's made some good pathways in doing so fairly transparently with the general public, which hasn't always been the case. So I think we're moving forward there. But I know we're coming up at the end of our time, but is there anything that we didn't touch on that anybody who's here can kind of think of that you want us to try to answer or talk about?
I wanted to ask, like DOD 8570, DOD 8140, how does that impact vehicles? So those are based on.
Yeah.
So
NASA assesses the position requirements on a position by position basis. It's different than the DoD. So we have positions that have some of those requirements, and we have many that don't. And so NASA does, I guess we take a different approach, right? We look at the position, what it entails, what it means. We look at the whole person concept, kind of like thinking about PERSEC, but we tend to look more at the whole person concept and say, does your background, education, certifications, and experience entail what we need to be comfortable with you doing this particular duty? Sometimes the answer is we kind of revert back and follow the guidelines that those policies say. And depending on what you're working on, sometimes we have to, because there's agreements that mandate such. And so, but yeah, in general, those things aren't necessarily mandatory for many of the positions that you traditionally think they would be, which is good, bad, and indifferent, right? But I find that we still do a reasonably good job of making sure people still have the same skill sets. It's just maybe not necessarily by doing the certification, which means we also don't have to pay for them.
yeah.
Does NASA have any publicly like published cybersecurity resources, or does it all flow up through other government agencies that you get your information from as well?
It's both. We certainly have our internal policies, but there's definitely the major ones. 2810 comes to mind. So we have our notice library.
There's a version of our software security standard, and there's a version of our system security standard for building space components, and some of that. So that's really interesting. If you look at like NPR 7120, there's a bunch of dots behind it, depending on the type of project. It's not going to contain security specific information. That'll be different for each project, but it will contain an amazing amount of information on NASA manages projects that includes the security steps. So as far as kind of seeing the inner workings of NASA, if you like reading like severe nonfiction, you can look at the 7120 series of policies.
Yeah.
And it is kind of interesting because you're reading through and it kind of takes through what it would take, like the Class A missions, think SLS, the space shuttle, space station, James Webb. It takes you through and tells you exactly what they had to do to pass each of those gates, or what they had to work through to manage that risk. So it is interesting. But yeah, I think the software security standard, I don't know the number off the top of my head, but there is a public version. There's an internal version that's,
I think it's 7150.
I think so.
So it's called the notice library.
Yeah.
And these references too, because we do have to include them in contracts, because when we solicit for that type of work, you need to know what you're actually bidding on, or what the requirements actually are. So, it behooves us to make those publicly available, so that when we put them in certain clauses, it's easy for companies to make sure that they can meet them.
And projects, it's probably more in the weeds than anybody cares about. But one of the ways that we used to manage that is when a project sort of initiated and launched, we have these overarching documents that might have 600 software security requirements. When we do that review, we look at that matrix of what's actually required. There's an addendum that kind of says, here's these required controls. Here's the things that you're actually required to do. You can do more, but here's the minimum baseline, because you don't always have to build Class A software, right? Which is for us like human safety type stuff. If you're not needing to build that, we're not going to make you follow all of those rules. And so those typically won't be published publicly, though.
Yeah, and then there's things again, the executive orders, the OMB memos. There's if you read through them, which a lot of them really aren't terribly long. And then there's some interesting stuff in there about requirements like data in transit and data at rest. That
I would say,
those are.
I was thinking about anything else that we publish. The only two things that are out there, NASA does have. I think we're allowed to call it a bug bounty program because there's really no bounty, but
The public vulnerability disclosure.
public vulnerability disclosure, right? So there is a website for public vulnerability disclosures in NASA systems. You can go there and check it out.
Yep.
You can also go to our OIG website. So we don't publish forensics case reports or anything like that. Every federal agency, most of them, have an inspector general's office, and that handles like internal investigations and such. If you go to NASA OIG, you can view several reports, including our FISMA audit results, if you really want to go to sleep. But there's a couple of cyber-related things on there. So if you want to kind of see what happens at the end of an investigation, there's some publishings. But every federal agency, for the most part, will publish a version of their FISMA audit report annually. Some agencies, you'll find that like 90% of it's redacted, so it's really no fun to read. In general, most of NASA's is actually public and you can read through it. And it is kind of interesting. I find it interesting. Of course, I work here. But even as somebody who doesn't work here, it's sort of an interesting read as a security professional, because it shows you what those auditing type agencies are looking for. And then you can also tie it to clicking on the investigations tab, and you kind of see what happens when it doesn't go too well, right?
Yeah.
And so it's kind of cool. And you can kind of look at other agencies' OIG sites. Basically, you name the agency, they have an OIG or an equivalent that you can go to. And it's interesting. You can read their audit reports that are required to be public. Again, most of the Intel community, for example, it's basically just a black box on 10 pages. But
Yeah.
Well, cool.
Anything else?
You guys don't have-
Yeah.
Just to wrap up a little, but
absolutely.
man, I hope you guys all dug that as much as I did. I don't know, saying that, yeah, quite all right. So just a quick kind of shameless plug here. So this is DevSecCon, the Virginia Beach chapter. It's kind of young. We're just getting going. If you are speakers, or any of you out there, or anybody on the live stream know of anybody relatively local to the Virginia Beach area, the Hampton Road area, who would be interested in presenting a talk on cybersecurity, software development, where they meet. DevSecCon is all about bringing together developers, security professionals, operations, and just having kind of open chats like this. Sometimes there's software demonstrations. Sometimes it's a straight up talk like y'all did tonight, which I found fascinating and want to thank you so much. Thanks again to Port and Starboard for sponsoring the space tonight, and to DevSecCon and Sneak for providing the food. And with that, we'll wrap up, and I will walk awkwardly over to the computer and switch over to our outro music. Thanks, everybody. All right.
Let it hear what the outcome music is. So what did you tell us report?
You'll be disappointed.
Off the record questions.
Yeah, here we
I get the interesting one for you.